Yeah, this is your show, buddy. That's why we pay you the big bucks.
All right. Before we get started, just let me remind the board that this is a planning session and a discussion session, so we're obviously not going to take action on anything we do today. I don't want to call these ground rules, but please, we do want some discussion on these things, whether you agree with what I tell you or not. Please, let's have some discussion on some of them. The only caution I would give you is that if we get to some point knowing that we're not going to take action on anything today, if we find ourselves going in circles on something, then let's move on and let's go somewhere else, because we're going to have to deal with them officially somewhere else anyway. So let me just start off with the budget. The number one item I've got on the budget, and of course I've got a list, but on the bottom I have some space for other folks to kick some things in there if you've got other things on your mind. Janet and I are working already on the process of the budget. Let me remind you of the calendar that we have. We intend to have to you at your May meeting the draft budget with the budget message for your consideration. And then my recommendation is to set a budget work session for May the 14th. So we can come back that night. I believe that's a Tuesday night, if I'm not mistaken. And go over the budget, answer questions, hash out any details we need to hash out, and then if we need to have another work session after that, then we can schedule another one somewhere in between, depending on what we end up working out. But at that point, I'd also recommend scheduling a public hearing for June the 3rd and actually adopting the budget June the 3rd, or if we have some issues there, we may have to bump it on into June, but by pretty much sticking to that time frame, that'll give us enough time to consider everything and still meet our deadline to get a budget passed before we get into some time constraints there. It is my goal to not have to see any kind of a tax increase. I'm not going to promise you that until I get all the numbers in, but we're going to work with some due diligence to make sure that doesn't happen as far as the general fund of the budget, the general funding of the budget. Now, one of the things that I do want to talk about, and this is something I want the board to consider, Jan and I have spent a considerable amount of time together looking over our numbers and where we're at financially, and the fund balance, the undesignated fund balance that we have. We are in no means bad financial shape. We actually have a pretty decent fund balance. There's a couple of different ways to calculate it, because you've got some monies in there that have to be designated for certain purposes, such as PAL bill money. If you consider the PAL bill monies into our calculations for our fund balance, we're up about a 45% fund balance. That seems like a lot, particularly when you look at some other organizations, and you'll hear Macon County talk about a 25% fund balance, but they have a much larger budget. Municipalities traditionally don't abide by those smaller percentages because our budgets just aren't that big. We've got a roughly $9 million budget, so it takes a larger percentage for us to have that cushion in there for those savings accounts for things that could go wrong. To be completely honest with you, the 45% gives you about $700,000. For lack of a better term, free and clear cash if you were to have something happen that you needed to use for something, not counting the funds that we have designated for other things we can't spend, like the PAL bill money or the fire department money that's rolled over into the enterprise fund you can't spend.
Does this include the water and sewer?
No, that is not. That's not including water and sewer, correct?
No, it's just a separate fund.
That's a separate money. Okay. One of the things that I would like for the board to consider, and here's the reason I'm going to tell you why. In the budget year before last, you all appropriated about $350,000 out of fund balance. You decreased your fund balance by about $350,000 just by due process of trying to keep the tax rate at a certain rate. The monies that you spend over the year, the stuff that comes up unexpectedly that you have to spend money for. And then last year, this current budget, I believe the appropriation was about $200,000 just to keep the budget balanced so that your tax rate didn't go up. I know why that happens, because you've got a poor economy, you don't have revenue coming in some cases your revenue's actually decreased, but it's not it's not recommended, and I'm not gonna recommend to you to keep trying to balance your budget on the back of that fund balance. So essentially, you're, at this point, on paper, you're down about 500,000 from where you were a couple of years ago. Now, predictions this year, we may come out enough this year on our revenue to pretty much break even with the 200,000 maybe that we committed this year. So we may not have to dip the 200,000 we borrowed from ourselves. We may be able to put back at the end of the year. So we may only be down about 350,000. But you know, again, I want to caution you all that I have no intention of trying to balance the budget on the back of that fund balance. You also want that money in there in case we get into some debt issues where we have to borrow money in the future. We'll talk about some of those a little later. To put us in a better financial position to borrow those funds to make sure that we've got the money to back them up. So my recommendation to you as a board is sometime in the future, and something I want you to consider, is to look at those percentages, look at those numbers, and my recommendation to you would be to essentially adopt a policy for you as a board to keep that fund balance at a minimum of 50%. And that's including the Powell bill money and the other monies that are in there, which essentially means we need to put back about 300,000 or so into that undesignated fund balance to get us up to about $1 million worth of, for lack of a better term, free and clear cash. And I think that ought to be a minimum. Now, if it's a policy the board sets, obviously something comes up during the year, you can change that, but that gives you some good hard guidelines to set goals for yourself and for me to stay within those constraints of those monies. Now, ideally, and I'm gonna lay this on the table, and there's a couple of ways you can get there. Ideally, I think for us, for a municipality our size and knowing our financial situation and looking several years into the future, I think that probably needs to be closer to 60%, which is about $1.3 million, $1.4 million. But that's something I would really like for the board to consider. Obviously, there are things that come up during the year that you can't plan for. There's some things on the table right now with the state, for instance, the privilege licenses. That may change based on what the state does. We are not going to change the way we budget at this point based on speculation on what they're going to do. But if they were to change the process by which we collect those privilege licenses, then that's something you need to be prepared to pull out of fund balance. But we do not need to be pulling money out of fund balance to run our normal day-to-day operations. Any discussion on that before I move on?
Janet, I mean, historically, Billy and I, historically, our fund balance was huge.
It's decreased in the last 4 or 5 years.
It certainly has. Now, we're actually doing projects, which, that costs money, although we've borrowed money for these projects. So it's not like we put just hard cash out. And we have, the amount of numbers of people we employ have gone up quite a bit. Are there other reasons than that, and then I guess the sales tax?
Well, I think a lot of it, when the company first hit, it hit down east first, and we wasn't really affected that much. And I agree, we've done a lot more projects. And then another thing is the economy's really hit hard now in the last year or two.
So
it's really affected our revenues.
More in the sales tax?
And it's like nobody's building, that's the water part too, nobody's building, that kind of stuff. And yes, the sales tax has sort of stayed even, but it didn't have the growth like it had been in the past.
Okay.
And let me tie into that comment for the second item on my agenda there under the budget consideration is the future evaluation. Something the board needs to keep in the back of your mind. Another reason for us to be very well set financially for the next couple of years is the county will go through a revaluation in 2015. What will end up happening is I think your values on your properties are going to drop, which means in order to increase the same revenue, your tax rate's got to come up.
Right.
It probably will not affect us as much as it will some of the rural areas of Macon County because your commercial properties seem to be, according to what I understand from some real estate folks, holding their value more proportionally than vacant land or residential structures out in the rural areas. So we've made some of the other areas, but I can already tell you some of the numbers that I see floating through on the fire department stuff, where we get our valuations from Macon County for our rural and our municipal areas to calculate our service fees. We've already seen a drop in those numbers, so it's coming. And then, of course, we'll have to generate a revenue neutral budget that year, or we'll have to at least show that rate what a revenue neutral budget will be that year. So that's some other financial considerations you all need to be thinking about for us to be in a strong financial situation in the next couple of years.
And I might add this to this too. If we could have saw what the future looked like, we probably shouldn't have set our rates so low, when the revaluation was last time. Because, we set it pretty low, the 25 cents, and then the economy hit, and then it would have been hard to ever raise tax after that.
Now, Janet, that's a policy, that's a board decision.
Well, I know, but I'm just saying,
And
financially.
revaluations are not intended as tax revenue enhancers, period. It's just intended to redistribute what each person's fair share is. Ideally, you should not gain or lose because of a revaluation.
Well.
And that's absolutely the way it should be looked at.
But
It's not
see,
a
if we-
revenue enhancer or decliner.
I'll just go ahead and add that if we'd had growth like we had in the past, because we had people building, coming up from, out of state and stuff, and all that stopped. Normally I agree that probably wouldn't have been affected, but it has affected us because we don't have anybody building, we have no commercial,
Absolutely.
and we've had no road tax.
Every
It's
immediate
affected
player.
both sides of the fund balance.
And I'll also say that we have been very diligent about attempting to collect the funds that are owed to us through back taxes and whatever reason. And at times that may seem a bit harsh, but we're doing that in fairness to the taxpayers that actually pay their taxes on time. It doesn't take much in our budget. 1 penny is roughly $50,000, somewhere in the neighborhood. It's not fair to the folks that pay to not try and collect from the folks that don't. So, and in all fairness, we're being very diligent to try and collect those revenues to get our percentages up to make sure we're collecting the amount that's owed to us, so we don't end up losing revenue that we should be collecting. Any other discussion on any of those comments?